Welcome back to Arsenal Pass. It's Hayden here with another Welcome to Rathe Hero Draft Guide video, this time on the Ninja Katsu. Now, Katsu is a pretty interesting hero in Welcome to Rathe Limited for a couple of reasons. And if you've ever listened to the pod, some of our pod episodes, or some of our videos, including our recent Welcome to Rathe gameplay videos, you've probably heard Brendan reminiscing about the Ninja Katsu in Welcome to Rathe, original Welcome to Rathe, back in the early days of Flesh and Blood. And one of the things about Katsu in Limited in particular is that originally, when Welcome to Rathe was first released, it was seen as the weakest of the four heroes. In fact, in the Limited calling season that kicked off, Flesh and Blood's first ever OP scene, Katsu had the least successful run in those events, not winning a single event, and in fact, in the Sydney calling top 8, not even being drafted in the top 8, falling to the wayside in favor of the Guardian, the Warrior, and the Brute decks. So, really interesting spot for Katsu. But what we now know, with a lot more Welcome to Rathe under our belt, is that Katsu is a very flexible and a very strong hero in the Welcome to Rathe draft format, and the seal format, of course. But today we're going to talk about draft and what makes Katsu so strong. Well, let's get into some of the strengths. You're going to notice a key theme when it comes to strengths in these Welcome to Rathe hero guide videos: the weapons. And it's for a good reason. The weapons in Welcome to Rathe are very strong. Welcome to Rathe was a foundational set, and it really was about teaching players how to play the game, how to understand turn cycles, fundamentals. So having really strong weapons that enable these plans, these fundamental plans, are actually really core to what all four of the heroes do in this format. Whether it be Bravo with his hammer, Rhino with the club, or of course Dorinthia, who is all about that Dawnblade weapon. And with the Kodachis in Katsu, it's no different. At first glance, the Kodachis look pretty weak, right? 2 resources for 2 damage over the 2 weapons. When you compare that to 2 for 4 off the club, or even 3 for 6 with Bravo, or 1 for 3 with Dawnblade, it looks like it pales in comparison. But one of the biggest strengths that Katsu has is those Kodachis and the flexibility of that split damage. As you play more Flesh and Blood and understand more about the game, you'll understand just how important split damage is. And these Kodachis enabling 2 damage split over 1-on-1 can be really difficult to deal with, because that damage is usually going to leak, or it's going to take a card from the opponent's hand, which does the exact same thing as a 3 damage weapon effectively. So that's where we can find a really strong strength in Katsu as a hero in Welcome to Rathe draft, and we can build around these Kodachis, whether it be an aggressive plan or a more defensive plan, like you might see with, reminiscent of Ira and Blitz, or Katsu Control in Classic Constructed. So we do have the flexibility. Of course, the inbuilt Go Again, if you've pitched a 0-cost card, is huge as well. Allows us to build these chains up. So that is really probably the primary strength of Katsu in this format, but it's not the only one. Efficiency of damage. So we have a lot of really proactive cards in Katsu. Cards that come in for 4 with Go Again off 1, Leg Tap in particular, or Head Jab, 0 for 3 with Go Again. They have inbuilt Go Again, or can get access to Go Again by being a combo card on a chain. And that's another one of the really big strengths of, Katsu in this format. Not only are the Kodachi is really efficient, but your attacks can provide really efficient damage and continue that chain. So the length of the chain is really something that Katsu is good at doing in this format, and the efficiency and flexibility of that damage. Can't go past synergies, of course. So while some of these combo cards are underrated at face value, when you take away that text box, as soon as that text box comes into play and these combo cards are active, they are very, very strong and above rate effects. If we take Whelming Gustwave, for instance, 0 for 3 at red that defends for 3 is below rate, but a 0 cost for 4 with Go Again that on hit draws a card and defends 3, that's well above rate. That's a snatch on steroids, effectively what you're getting when you pair that with Surging Strike. So the synergies in Katsu are the biggest strength, and maybe though why Katsu struggled a bit in the initial sort of printings of Welcome to Rathe. Took a bit longer to understand how to use these synergies and how to get the most out of them. But when we get into archetypes, we're going to talk about how you can leverage some of the synergies to the sort of best of their ability and get the most out of them. In terms of strengths, offensive cycle. Katsu is, I think the strongest offensive class in this format, and very, very good at what it wants to do. You'll notice this, we'll get into the weaknesses with the trade-off for this offensive sort of power. You've got inbuilt Go Again, and you've got some really powerful effects that tie in with the synergy that we just talked about. Also, a class that really utilizes a lot of the generics in a good way, especially the offensive generics, the attacking generics, to power out really big turns, push damage, leak damage, and just, get opponents to 0. That's what Katsu can do really, really well. The ability to house generics. That would probably be my last strength for Katsu. Just talked about it a little bit, or alluded to it in my previous point. But Katsu is a hero that can really utilize basically all of the generics in this format, thanks to the fact that you've got these Kodachis that can be super flexible to be really aggressive, or can actually be quite defensive as well. So a lot of the generics we see can be housed in a Katsu shell, because Katsu can play anywhere from really low amounts of resources, 6, 7, 8 blues, up to 13, 14, 15 blues in different game plans. And we will talk about those when we get into the archetypes. Now, let's move on, talk about some of the weaknesses, some of the things that offset some of these strengths in Katsu for Welcome to Rathe Draft. When it comes to weaknesses for Katsu and Welcome to Rathe Limited, there's a pretty glaring one that stands out, and that's the defensive value that the class has overall. The average defensive value of cards for Katsu is lower than the other 3 classes, and that comes from those starter cards, those League Taps, those Surging Strikes, and those Head Jabs. They have 2 defensive value, whereas cards in Guardian, Warrior, Brute, all those cards have defensive value of 3. So this is where Katsu really offsets itself in terms of the weakness side of it, what it's giving up in order to have that flexibility of the Go Again. How great is a League Tap? 1 for 4 with Go Again. But, the offset, the downside to that, is that defensive value for 2. And this is something that you need to be aware of when you're building these decks out, when you're drafting these decks in Welcome to Rathe Limited, because what a lot of people find, and this is something that happened a lot in the early sort of days of Welcome to Rathe, is terrible on defense. People getting punished trying to play turn cycles because they were leaking damage left, right, and center, because the decks weren't very streamlined and they were taking damage over the top. So carrying these cards that defend for 2 and using their offensive ability is fantastic, but you've got to weigh it up and understand how that plays in with the rest of the deck. And that's why generics and these combo cards, these next steps after the starters, are so important in these Katsu decks. And we'll talk more about those when we get to the archetypes, and which archetypes want what, and how you want to build these out to ensure that you don't get punished for all these 2 defense cards. Next, when it comes to weaknesses, the synergy. We talked about synergy and strength, but synergy is also a weakness in Katsu. We talked about a card like Whirlwind Gust Wave. When that is on, when that is played after a Surging Strike, huge value, massive upside. But when you don't have these Surging Strikes, when you just got a Whirlwind Gust Wave in your hand, it's a lot weaker, and it's going to hurt you. And so it's really important how you build the decks out in order to get the most out of these synergistic cards, because if these synergy cards are at the sort of the floor of where they could be, they're quite bad, and your deck overall is going to be really clunky, and it's really going to struggle. So the ratios of combo starters, the starters of those lines, and the actual combo cards is really important. You're going to want, traditionally, more of the starter cards than the combo cards, unless, of course, those combo cards are going to be your resources. So blue resources like Whirlwind Gust Wave and Rising Knee Thrust are really important, because first primary, they're your resource cards, but they can be played on these combo starters, and you get the upside of them. So these blue cards that look quite weak can actually be a lot stronger when played on these chains. So you sort of get the best of both worlds. Anyway, it isn't the easiest class to draft, all things said. We've just talked about 2 of the biggest weaknesses and how you need to offset these in the way that you draft and build decks. And that kind of brings me to my 3rd weakness for Katsu, is that, it just isn't the easiest class to draft. I think it, in fact, is the hardest class to draft in this format, because there's quite a few archetypes that you can play into, and you need to offset a lot of things. You need to bring the deck together. A lot of the other classes, in fact, the other 3 classes, can draft a deck full of almost 3 defense cards and, really efficiently play turn cycles. Katsu can't do that as well, unless you really set it up, or you really craft this sort of deck that can do that. So that is probably, the biggest weakness that Katsu has, is it's just not easy to draft or even to play. It's time to get in and talk about these archetypes, though. Although Ninja isn't easy to draft, Katsu isn't easy to draft in this format, you have access to some fantastic archetypes that you can play into. And once you know some of the cards and how these should play out, you're going to get really rewarded for understanding these at a table. A lot of players who haven't done a lot of Welcome to Rathe Draft, or possibly haven't played a lot of Katsu, probably aren't going to understand how to draft Katsu, and you can get really rewarded for this. Often you can find yourself as maybe the only Katsu drafter at a table, or even if there's 2 Katsu drafters at a table, they might be really focused on certain segments of Katsu, like the combo starters and combo cards, or drafting strong generic aggressive decks. And in fact, Katsu has a lot of different archetypes it can play into because of that flexibility that we talked about earlier. So the first archetype I want to talk about is probably one that's easier to draft, I think. This is the easiest one to draft, and that's the Kickline Aggro deck. Name suggests it, really. This is all about League Taps, Rising Knee Thrusts, Blackout Kicks, and if you're lucky enough to get one, Hurricane Technique is fantastic in this deck as well. Probably one of the better cards that Katsu has access to in terms of what it can do. That Hurricane Technique is a really powerful card. But what this deck looks like is you're focusing on utilizing 3 resources a turn generally. So it could look something like pitch a blue, Kodachi, Leg Tap, Rising Knee Thrust. Right there with a 3-card hand, you're coming in for the 2 damage, 4 damage up to 6, and then the 5 damage. That's 11 off 3 cards. That's well above rate. And split out damage. That's really hard to defend. So turns could look like that. Other turns you could really get that combo line going. Come in for a Kodachi, come in with a Leg Tap. Perhaps the opponent doesn't want to commit 2 cards to defend 4 on a red Leg Tap, so you get to trigger Katsu. You discard a 0-cost card, whatever it is, maybe it's your additional blue. You go and find the Blackout Kick or the Rising Knee Thrust that you need. Have the other one in arsenal ready to go. You're coming in for, the full combo line there. 1 into 4 is 5, plus another 5, 10, plus a 7. You're looking at 17 damage potentially in that turn. So this is what the kick line deck is really looking to do. Utilize those kick cards, the Leg Taps, the Rising Knee Thrust, and the Blackout Kicks. But of course, you can't just build a deck entirely around those. You're not going to be able to get enough of them. And you need the deck to be serviceable when you don't draw a Leg Tap. So some of the other cards that you're looking for in this are things like Nimblism and Nimble Strike. Nimblism powers up these attacks, but also Nimble Strike can then utilize those Nimblisms to get go again, and it just gives your deck a bit more flexibility. Mitigate some of the awkwardness that you can get. Flick Flack. Flick Flack is basically going to be good in any Katsu deck, especially the red, because of how you can stop cards like Snatch or on-hit effects, and you're going to be playing a number of combo cards. So although you want to be pretty aggressive, you're not always going to be able to do this, and Flick Flack is a card that can help you there. Scar for a Scars, Head Jab, red, blue, serviceable cards because they have go again, or the blue is a resource card. And you are going to need to be looking for some blue resource cards. This is the deck that probably plays the least amount of blues in the Katsu archetypes. You can generally get away with like 7 to 8 blues, especially if you've got a couple of yellow Rising Knee Thrusts, or maybe Wounded Blow, great card because it defends for 3 and can be played on the end of a chain. That can sort of, fill up that spot. But yeah, those are some of the other cards you are looking for. Cards that can be played after a Leg Tap, like a red Wounding Blow or a yellow Wounding Blow. Also defend for 3, so they're good on off turns. It's kind of what you want your deck to look like. Very low cost. You don't really want too many cards that cost too much. Scale the Battlescape is another card that can be used because it can come out of arsenal and filter cards for you. I actually really like red Scale the Battlescape in this deck because it can help mitigate and filter these hands. Other cards I'm looking for, Snapdragon Scalers, of course, because of what that can do in terms of just making that chain longer and making some of these awkward hands more playable. They can even be used to, if you don't have the Leg Tap, Rising Knee Thrust into Blackout Kick is still really serviceable off that Snapdragon Scalers. But other than that, that's basically what the Kickline Aggro deck is all about. Now let's get on to another archetype. Doing a real 180 flip with our next archetype, we have Kodachi Attrition. If you're familiar with Ira in Blitz or Katsu Control in Classic Constructed, then you're probably going to know a bit about how this archetype functions. It's really similar in ethos to these decks, especially the older Ira decks, where you are trying to be quite defensive, grind down the opponent, take their bigger turns and turn that damage that they're trying to push through into 0. Or maybe 1 or 2, they might be able to leak some damage, but ideally you want to get that to 0. You're looking at really efficient defensive cards. Often your hands are being used to defend, maybe 2 or 3 cards to defend, and then pitching a blue and coming back with a Kodachi, and possibly a threat on the end of a chain. Like a red Wounding Blow, Pounding Gale is a phenomenal if you can get them. Things like this, things that you would see traditionally in Ira, or things that can do a bit of a serviceable replacement job. That's what we're looking at in these kind of archetypes. Some of the, key cards that you're looking for in this, well, you need some blues, first of all, because of the amount that you're going to want to pitch. We talked about in the aggro sort of archetype, we want around like 7 to 8. In this, we want more so around 11 to 12 blues in this, and we're looking for these to be able to play our cards. Blue cards that defend 3, and ideally a combo, because if we pick up some Flick Flacks, those are some of the most important cards we can find. They're going to work well with those. So outside of our blue resource cards, top priority picks. Well, Flick Flack, we just talked about it. Sync Belows, Unmovables work really well in this deck. If we do draft some Unmovables, we are probably looking to have a few more blues, maybe up to 14 sort of blues in the deck. Maybe even 15 actually, if you do have a number of Unmovables and some blues that don't pitch for 0. We're looking for those cards that can go on the end of a chain, those sort of threats that we can get. So, Snatch is a fantastic one because you can go Kodachi, Snatch, and that's going to threaten you to draw an Arsenal card, and you do have some reasonable Arsenal cards in the deck. Pounding Gale we talked about as a phenomenal one. Red Wounding Blow, even something like a red Regurgitating Slog is fine because it's 7 damage off 2 cards. These are the kind of cards we're looking at, and then just cards that defend for 3. We're actually playing probably the least amount of ninja cards in these kind of style decks traditionally, or at least less combo starters. We're not really focused on these combo starters. We can let the other ninja drafters at the table take those. we'll take some of the other cards that are going to help us defend a bit more and prioritize those, and then wheel some of these combo cards that maybe people don't want and put those into our deck. So other than that, Iron Rot equipment, really important. Razor Reflexes are really good, especially red ones, because those can be your threat on those Kodachi attacks. You can look for actually having some threats for the in-game. So it's not all about just having these sort of Kodachi threat. At some point, you're going to want to try and win the game, especially once you open up a really big life lead from the attrition of just sort of chipping in with those Kodachis, using the efficiency of those. One of the things I like to do is maybe put in like a surging strike line. So maybe I have 1 or 2 red and or yellow surging strikes, 1 or 2 Whelming Gust Wave. Those are quite good. Paired with a Razor Reflex, I can set up a bit of an in-game. And that's why I really prioritize cards like Sink Below. They're going to help me tuck those cards sort of in the early to mid game and get back to those, or I can pitch them and come back to them. Otherwise, it would be things like a Barraging Broadhide, some of these maybe bigger attacks, or one of my other favorites. We talked about Regurgitating Slog already. Red Slogism, or Blue Slogism even, and Regurgitating Slog. Just one of each as an in-game sort of win condition to dominate through damage. That's what the deck looks like. Now let's go on to something that is on the theme of Regurgitating Slog and Slogism. Possibly my favorite archetype with Katsu, and a real fun one. 2-cost finishers. The 2-cost finisher deck, as I say, is probably one of the most enjoyable sort of archetypes you can draft and play. And it really focuses on, very few sort of traditional ninja aspects. You think Katsu traditionally combo and pushing wide damage, and it does some of those things to a degree, but this deck is all about some of these cards like Pummel, Slogism, Regurgitating Slog, big damage, and some cards that traditionally Katsu might not want to play paired with the Kodachis. So you can use the Kodachis as, kind of attrition threats like you might in the attrition deck we just talked about. On certain turns where maybe you need to defend. On other turns, maybe you only come in with one, and then you come in with a threat, like a Regurgitating Slog, for instance. Other turns, you might be going a bit wider once you find your combos. And the key sort of combo line in this build is the head jab into Open the Center combo. And that's because we really want to pair something like Open the Center with a Slogism or a Pummel. So on the chain, before we play the head jab, we can play our Slogism, then we can play the head jab, and then we can play the Open the Center, and that Slogism is going to go on to the Open the Center. And dominate for 11 potentially or 12 with a red. It's a lot of damage that we're presenting and making it really difficult for our opponent to defend. So this is kind of what the archetype's all about in terms of some of the key cards of what you're looking for. Well, of course, you are looking for that combo line, head jab, into Open the Center that we talked about. Goliath Gauntlets and Heart and Cross Trap are potentially 2 of the most important cards that you really want to pick up because of the high cost of the deck and also because of that dominate effect with Open the Center. Slogism, Regurgitating Slog, do similar things to the Open the Center line we talked about, although not as efficient because we are in Katsu. That head jab Open the Center line is going to be one of the ones that we really look towards. But Slogism, because we can play it on some of these other cards, is really good. Regurgitating Slog. Often want 1 to 2 of the cards like Wounding Bull or Barraging Broadhide, because we're going to be playing around 14 to 15 blues, because we need these blues in order to service these really big hands we just talked about. Pummel, that's high on the list. If you're not finding Slogisms, then Pummel does the same thing on those turns with Open the Center. And if you've already seen the Guardian video that we've done, the Guardian deep dive, hero sort of profile, we talk about an OTK Guardian, and this can actually function in similar ways. You can have some really big turns with Heart and Cross Trap, or potentially an Energy Potion, if you've picked up one of those. Energy Potion I quite like in this archetype, because you can go Kodachi, drop an Energy Potion on a turn, and then set that up for late game. It does a bit of a Heart and Cross Trap impression. And you can possibly even have both. And you can set up these big turns. Maybe you've got double Slogism into Open the Center or Regurgitating Slog. And so you can set up these sort of turns where you can almost kill your opponent from sort of like 12, 13, 14 damage potentially. So that's what the deck is all about. You're not really necessarily being defensive a lot unless you've got awkward hands that don't work. And you do want to preserve your life total, though. That is important because you want to make sure you can get to these big turns. Other than that, you just want to fill the deck out with resources and some good cards that can defend. Defense reactions are still really important in this because of our high blue count. We can easily play our movables. Sink Belows are great for, smoothing out some of our hands. Looks like, of course, always good. That's what we're kind of looking for when we draft this 2-cost finishers deck. Onto our last archetype now. And this archetype is one that looks a little bit more familiar to, I guess, traditional Katsu players, or if you think about what a Katsu deck might be in Welcome to Rathe Draft, this is probably the archetype that you might think of first. It's very fluid to a degree. But this is Twin Line Katsu, and basically what we're looking to do here is draft a pretty ninja heavy deck focusing on 2 combo lines, which is traditionally how Katsu was kind of drafted anyway. For me, I like to look at Kick Line and Surging Strike because I think those are the most efficient ones and allow me to still play game plans with Kodachi. So you're still drafting a good number of 0-cost blues. They're always going to be important in any Katsu deck we draft because of the Kodachis. But then we're pairing on top of that just good, combo lines. A number of leg taps if we can get them, a number of Surging Strikes, and then the Whelming Gust Waves, the Rise Knee Thrusts, and maybe 1 or 2 Blackout Kicks to go with those combo lines. That's kind of what we're looking at. So yeah, you're going to be playing a lot of ninja cards in this comparative to the other archetypes where there's a lot of generics that are really important. But in saying that, there's a number of generics that are still going to be really key for us that we want to pick up. Snapdragon Scalers is still really, really good in this deck. Razor Reflex, Snatch, Scar for a Scar. Those cards that are really strong anyway are still going to be really strong in this ninja archetype. It's just that we're really focused on, instead of one combo line plus a bunch of generics that really support that, like the the Slogisms and the Pummels with the Open the Center line, or some of these like the Wounding Blows and some of these 0-cost cards with the Aggro line or the Nimblisms, etc. We're more focused on just the ninja cards with a few good generics to pair with it, resource cards, and then maybe some cards that can defend to sort of smooth it out. That's kind of what you're looking for when you play this deck. It's, as I say, it's probably the more traditional. I think it's a bit harder to draft than, say, the Kick Line aggro deck, because you do have to balance up the 2 sort of combo lines and how they play. And if you get a hand that's like leg tap, Whelming Gust Wave, doesn't really do too much, unfortunately. So we can also pick up some cards that can help smooth us out. Sink Below, Scour the Battlescape, red, even yellow I've played. It can help you smooth out these hands and work on the chain out of Arsenal. And we're just kind of playing a bit of a mid-range game. We're looking to set up combo turns. In between turns where we don't have combo lines, we're probably maybe Kodachi Threat, blocking with 2 cards, or just kind of playing how our hand's going. We're often playing quite sort of turn cycle to turn cycle, putting a key piece into our arsenal, and then waiting until we get a combo turn, and then kind of breaking out with that. And in terms of that, that's kind of what our last archetype looks like. But before we wrap up, I do want to talk about some of the key things to consider when you're looking at Katsu and Welcome to Rathe Draft. Alright, I talked about it at the top of the video. Katsu is not the easiest hero to draft in Welcome to Rathe. And with that in mind, there's a few things that I think you could make sure you're considering when you're drafting Katsu and when you're playing it in Welcome to Rathe Draft. And the first is 0-cost blues. I talked about it throughout all of these archetypes, but you're going to really struggle to put together any decent Katsu deck if you aren't considering what your 0-cost blues look like. One thing to just have 0-cost blues, you could fill these out with Scour the Battlescapes and Nimblisms and whatever else, and your deck's probably going to be pretty average. What you really want is these blues to have some functionality, especially in the ones where you're looking to play a few more. But even in the weaker decks, if those blues have functionality, they're going to help smooth out some of the awkwardness that comes with that synergy aspect that we talked about. So in a deck with Surging Strike line, blue Whelming Gust Waves are fantastic because if you draw the double blue hand, they still have utility. Also, you can discard these as well, which is one of the great things about the blue, combo lines. But if they also defend for 3, you've got a lot more options in terms of what you can do. So the blue combo cards are actually genuinely fantastic. But things like blue Sink Below, they have homes in, that combo sort of style setup deck with the 2-cost matters that we talked about, or in the defensive deck because we can tuck our threats for in-game. But there are also 0-cost blues that help our Kodachis come in. So 0-cost blues, very important, and the utility and the sort of usefulness of these 0-cost blues is something to really, really consider when you're drafting. In terms of our next sort of, key consideration, make sure you really know what you want to do before you start your turn. So when you're lining up your defense during your opponent's turn or you're thinking about defending, just stop, take that extra little bit of time and work out exactly what you're going to do in your turn, because sequencing can matter a lot when you're playing Katsu. Especially when you're doing things like Kodachis, maybe you're going to turn your Wounding Bull into no longer having that extra buff because you're now on more life than your opponent or the same life because of the Kodachis. Maybe you need to consider what happens for your on hits when you Katsu. Okay, if I defend with this card, I'm not going to have a card to Katsu with when I hit, or if I hit, and I'm not going to be able to have my combo line. What if I don't hit? What if my opponent decides to block my red leg tap with a Sink Below or a card plus an Iron Rot? Does that screw up my whole turn because I need to Katsu? So these are the things that you really need to think about, and do this on your opponent's turn because it's really going to impact how you actually defend. And one of the things you really need to do with Katsu, because of these 2 defense cards, is get the most out of each of your turn cycles. You really can't afford to be playing inefficiently through the game, because what will happen is you'll start to lose turn cycles, and then you'll get into the spiral where you can't really get back into it because your opponent can just take tempo and not really give it back to you, and you're going to need a bit of a worldy turn to sort of pull it out with, leg tap into red rising knee thrust into red blackout kick or something like that. And yeah, it can happen, but if you're more sort of thoughtful about it and setting these turns up and thinking about how you're going to play it out, you're just going to run away with games more and be less susceptible to having these awkward turns or your opponent swinging the tempo and keeping it. One other thing I want to talk about that's a real key consideration when you're playing Katsu is it's okay to pitch your red cards. What's really good about, maybe not having quite the right number of zero-cost blues you want or zero-cost yellows to even help you fill it out, is some of your zero-cost reds can be perfect to pitch, especially if you're looking to a game where you're going to go late and you're going to get these cards back. Or, say you have your red Whelming Gust Wave in hand, and it is your only red Whelming Gust Wave. Rather than looking to try and set that up in Arsenal or do something with it, then you can pitch that card and come back, keep it in your deck for when you can Katsu it later on. One of the sort of common plays you can make, or lines of play, pitch a red Whelming Gust Wave, say in this instance, come in with the first Kodachi, pitch your blue Unmovable, and then come in with red Raging Onslaught. You've utilized your red card, put it back into your deck, and you've still got the Kodachi with go again. Especially if it's your only zero cost in your hand, often pitching the red sort of zero cost is perfectly fine. The last thing I do want to talk about in terms of key considerations with Katsu and Welcome to Rathe Draft is that the stronger cards tend to go in all ninja lists. So, Flick Flags, Red Sink Belows, Scar for a Scar, Snapdragon Scalers, Snatch Red, all of these decks will play them and play them really, really well. While some of these cards are okay in other decks, like maybe Snatch and Guardian for instance, in Katsu, these cards are always going to be strong because of the flexibility that you have with the Kodachis. So drafting these cards high, what I often find is that I probably lean towards Katsu a lot of the time with these cards, if it's open, because of how good these cards are in almost any Katsu archetype. And because Katsu has a lot of archetypes, I actually find myself drafting Katsu quite a lot of the time because of how undervalued people sort of are on Katsu, or they undervalue some of the cards. So that's something to keep in mind and watch out for if you're drafting Katsu in Welcome to Rathe. And with that, I'm wrapping it up. That's 4 key things that I think you should consider when drafting and playing Katsu in Welcome to Rathe Draft, and that's our hero guide on Katsu. Now, there's a few different archetypes we talked about here. Some of these are going to require some practice and a bit of theory crafting and just trying these, but my recommendation is just try some of them. Think about some of these cards that we talked about, or that I talked about here, that are really important. Build around those and work out what archetype. Like I said in my last point, the strong cards are strong in Katsu no matter what, and you'll be able to find yourself in these archetypes because people will often undervalue them. So, that's it for now, and we'll see you in the next Hero Draft Guide video.